Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TruthWorks. I'm your host, Jessica Neal, and I'm with my co-host, Peter Clark. Hey, Pete, what's up?
Hey, Jessica, how are you? Good, good.
Another new background.
Yeah, I just
Where
keep
are you?
changing it up. So I'm in
Where are you?
our Palo Alto office today, and then tried to find a room with not too much clutter in the background
Well, you
or a
did
big
good.
whiteboard. I was
Yeah,
going to
you
write
did.
some equations on the whiteboard behind me and look like I was smart, but I didn't have time.
Well,
So
you know who could actually do that is our guest
that's what I
today.
was
I'm
thinking.
pretty sure he could do that.
And then
You
I
know,
figured you'd call me on it, so I figured it was probably safer to not write anything
yeah,
myself.
especially with our guest. And today I'm actually very excited. We're talking to Mik Kersten, who is a founder, an author, a scientist. And he talks and researches a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, as you all know on this podcast, because we talk about it a lot. But it's really digging into how organizations work and how they get in their own way. And he's writing a book right now, which he's going to tell us a lot about. It's about to launch, but it really tackles a topic that I think is important for all of us to be thinking about. And with AI, we all talk about AI all the time, but it's a big thing. And you're going to need to focus on work and how your organization is structured a lot more. And Mik is here to tell us all about it. Welcome to the show, Mik. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Pete. Great to be here.
Well, first, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and how you got into this work, and tell us about the book that's getting ready to launch, I think, next week, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's launching on July 14th. So exciting times.
Ooh, exciting. Buy Mik's book. We'll talk about that at the end of the show. But how did this all start for you?
Yeah, so I spent basically a decade as a developer. So just writing software, a lot of open source software, as a researcher as well back at Xerox PARC near where you are, Pete.
Yeah.
And back there, I think the neat thing with Xerox PARC is it was always around the intersection of people and technology. And I was very interested in that and really worked a lot on connecting the way that we build software with the way that people work. And ended up doing my PhD in it. For my PhD, founded a company called Tasktop, was CEO of that for 17 years. And in that commercial context, we built these tools that connected the way people work across organizations. And what I realized is just how disconnected that work across organizations is, because we saw the flow of data and collaboration and things like tasks and projects and products and initiatives across all these tools. And so we studied that data, with kind of the research backgrounds that we had on my leadership team. And we realized that there was just these massive disconnects in how organizations are wired that really get in the way of productivity, of employee engagement, and of, in the end, customer outcomes. So I wrote a first book about that called Project the Product, which took that initial data and said, okay, we need to actually not structure things around project work where the business is throwing stuff over the fence to technology and the way these enterprises work, because we already had that whole generation of startups, unicorns, cloud native companies that figured out better ways of working. But somehow, a lot of large enterprises never actually made that shift. And then we did another round of research on that with fresh data, with additional data from even the initial data set was 3,600 different value streams at various organizations. The next set was 8,000 value streams, and we realized these problems are improving very slowly. And all of a sudden, what's happening is that the ability to amplify knowledge work outputs, whether that's code or campaigns or any kinds of digital outputs, was not really going to work, because all these organizations were structured for maximizing outputs and not actual outcomes. And so that's really where, 2 years ago, and by the way, I spent a lot of time building out an agentic solution at the company that acquired my company at Planview, learned just how powerful that was going to be, and realized that, these 10x productivity benefits will be real, but none of them will be realized if our organizational structures remain the way they are today.
Yeah, because you can do 10 times the work, but that doesn't matter if your organization can't absorb it or, put it in the flow, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Well, like what you said, we tend to measure outputs versus outcomes, right? So yeah, here we did a bunch of stuff, but was it worthwhile? So
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's happened is that we've been in this, and I kind of, in the book Output to Outcome, this new book, I look at it through the lens of these technological revolutions, because every time we've had these major technological revolutions, they've come with new management systems and new organizing principles, right? Organizational charts came way back from the age of railways. steam and railways, right? Because all of a sudden in the US, you now didn't have a bunch of people in a factory. You had this very distributed organization that had to make trains run on time across North America. And we still have those managerial tools of organizational charts. This age of software and digital that really was the last, really since the 70s, since the microprocessor took over the peaches near where you are, the peach orchards where you are, Pete.
Right, right.
We've had these new organizing principles around agility, around product management, around technology and innovation that have really created a new set of management systems that some companies wielded really well and became these new tech giants and unicorns, and that other companies just never quite adapted to, which was what was showing up through our data set. And I can talk about that a little bit more. And now I think with this, every one of these revolutions means some kind of constraint on production just becomes easy and scalable. And now all of a sudden, the constraint we had on, let's say, developer productivity, knowledge worker productivity is gone, or it's quickly disappearing. So we're moving from a world where the thing that organizations optimize for so much, right, which is the constrained productivity of development teams, now is going to be unconstrained. And what happens then? Because all of a sudden you can build, where you're going to build one app, you can now build 10 in parallel in a day, not a month or not a year. And how can the organization, the market absorb them? Do you have the right organizational structure and feedback loops? And what the data showed us is most organizations just don't. They don't have those structures in place.
No. And they're likely not moving on it very quickly right now.
Yeah.
Is my guess.
Hey, what do you?
Yeah, talk more about the data. Like in the companies that were unable to make the shift to become, the tech giant or the unicorn. What were the patterns and the themes that you were seeing with those organizations?
Right. So what we were seeing, and the actual data, and sort of the most key finding that we found is when we studied the end-to-end flow of value, all the way from ideas and initiatives being planned to when they were delivered to customers, only 8% of that end-to-end time was teams actually creating value. It was a value creation done by teams. And the rest was upstream processes and planning and approvals, or downstream reviews and security and so on. And so you've got this world, basically these value streams in these organizations, where if you multiply the productivity of that team by 2, so all of a sudden they can do twice as much, you're actually not getting any more value any faster to the customer, to the market, because they were not the constraint. The constraint is upstream and downstream of the teams. Now try to multiply that by 10, and then you still get nothing more. And that's why we're now in this world where there's some amazing work that's being done by teams adopting AI and token maxing and doing all those things, but it's not translating into customer outcomes because the organization's not structured to translate to those outcomes. And we realize this runs very deep, because if you're going to actually get that kind of fast feedback loops from teams directly to customers, you need completely different kinds of ownership and empowerment structures, which I think we saw a lot of those created through this era of software and cloud. But again, a lot of organizations have not adopted those. And I think the ones who move faster to these really empowered, more autonomous teams directly connected to customers are now able to leverage AI much more quickly than organizations who still have these legacy ways of working.
8%.
8.
What?
So
Well, to that
crazy.
point, so yeah, why do you think? I mean, the data's out there, right? The visibility of successful organizations, the things that they've done to be successful, and yet here we are, 8%. Like, we still seem to struggle with sort of embracing and adopting and adapting to change, right? Like, what do you think is the biggest sort of blocker for organizations actually making a significant change?
Right. And I should qualify this, the data is through to 2024, right? So it's really before that kind of this new wave of AI and agentic engineering hit, first of all, right?
Well,
But I
my
don't think
prediction is the number goes down with that, but
yeah,
we'll see.
exactly. So that's right. I think and that's really the challenge, is that I think we've seen what good looks like in organizations. We've seen it in, again, startups and tech giants who are, it's where that 8 is more like 80%, right? We've seen it scale up to organizations the size of, say Amazon, who actually have that entire very hierarchical type of autonomy and empowerment with really basically 10 levels of cascade. And so I think And those are the kinds of structures, and this is really some of the points I make in Output to Outcome, where you can apply AI and really amplify the pace of delivery of outcomes to your customers. But I think what's happened for a lot of, especially larger scale organizations, enterprises, but also organizations who just have not grown up entirely cloud native. Actually, I think the cloud native thing really did help. That said, I can also point to a bunch of cloud native organizations
Right.
who are in that like 8 to 20% range for the portion of time that gets spent creating value rather than in meetings and approvals and planning and replanning and budgets and all those other fun things. I think what's happened is that we've created this organizational wiring that's creating overly high coordination costs and not providing enough autonomy low enough in the organization. And I think a lot of that happened with sort of, especially organizations that went through digital or agile transformations. They basically added all of these additional ceremonies and matrix lines and all this additional process on top of their org chart. And they actually never changed their org chart. And so you've got these competing organizational structures. So you've got that, the structure, which is your org chart. You've got the structure, which is the way that you deliver value, which is your kind of these horizontal value streams or agile ways of working. And it's got its own set of meetings and ceremonies and reviews and so on. And then you've got the incentive structure of leadership, which is based on some kind of objectives and NBOs or OKRs and so on. And then you've got the technological structure, right? Which is the architecture of the organization in terms of what good looks like, as those things are more closely aligned. And I actually do bring up some stories of Netflix, Jessica, because Adrian Cockcroft was one of my inspirations through this, and he helped us.
Yeah, I hired Adrian into the
Really?
company. Yes, I
No
did.
way.
I found him. I sure did.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he definitely inspired me in how I scaled my own company and provided me a lot of mentorship, which I then reflect in Output to Outcome. I tell some of the stories that of my experiences with him teaching me.
Yeah.
But I think what Netflix got right is that alignment of the technological architecture, the team structure, and the leadership structure, and hopefully the org chart. But a lot of companies, those are misaligned. And as soon as those are misaligned, you've got these like 3 or 4 competing structures, which have to be coordinated all the time, which means there's all these meetings and reviews and documents and presentations and so on. And that's what creates all of those basically wait states upstream and downstream of teams. And it just does not scale.
Mm-hmm.
And with AI, of course, the scaling pressures now 2x, 10x, whatever it's going to be as frontier models continue to improve. But I think we just have to completely revisit the organizational chart.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true. And I mean, I wouldn't say like we evolved, our structure over time for sure. But I think one of the things that even as we were getting big, we still stayed fairly flat. Like we never implemented, you were a senior engineer and a senior IC. Then we had manager, director, VP, and C-level. And that was it. We didn't have like senior director, senior vice president. We didn't, even in engineering, we resisted adding like architect or principal, or it's like, no, everybody's an architect. Everybody's a principal. Like, we didn't want those like the complexity and all the layers to, not have people take accountability and responsibility. Right. And so every year it was like, oh, can we, add a layer? It's like, no, we can't add any layers, because and mostly people wanted to add, and I think companies do this and they do it for well-intentioned, but I see companies as they're scaling, they're like, okay, well, we want a ladder for people to grow, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so then they add, oh, senior engineer and senior director, and, and then it ends up doing the opposite of what you want it to do. It just makes everybody slower. And you can pay people at a senior level. They don't need the title, right? And when people are like, oh, that's my job, and then that's not my job, so I'm not doing that. Like, that's when the complexity starts to kind of enter the system, and we just never resisted.
Yeah, actually, and I've been guilty of that myself, is over-engineering those title levels, right? It's
Yeah.
with the right intentions.
Right.
And a lot of engineers wanting to dissect them into
Yeah.
all sorts of bands and all
Right.
sorts of titles and all sorts of functions and so on. But yeah, I think what we're seeing is when you have to go up a level or two to ask permission to do something, that slows everything down. So if you've
Right.
got a culture or organizational structure that's really all around empowerment of teams and lower down the org chart, you can move fast. But when you've got a culture where you have to go ask permission up or kind of beside you in this structure, then things go slow. And then there's this concept that actually really comes from Gene Kim and Steve Spear's book, Buying the Winning Organization, that comes out as one of the main the models in Open Telecom of independence of action, right? If teams don't have an independence of action because they don't have that kind of empowerment, because you created the wrong kind of hierarchy or too hierarchical in the organization, or you just don't have the right mechanisms of ownership and empowerment in it, things just go slow.
What do you think is going to happen to the companies that don't get on top of this?
I think they're going to spend a bunch on tokens and AI budgets. I think their CFOs are going to notice, and I think they'll basically, I think their cost base will change because they're going to continue investing to some level because there's so much pressure to do so. So they're going to reallocate, and this is, I think, terrible outcome, reallocate a significant portion of their budget to tokens and away from humans. And they're going to end up with lower business performance, not higher. And then they're going to try to adjust by rehiring humans, but then they'll be further behind because they won't have fixed the fundamental problem, which is, again, the organizational structure. So I think in the same way that we saw companies that were too slow to move to kind of the digital native organizational, really, this is about operating models, right? It's the organizational structure plus all the mechanisms, which is really the operating model. The ones that did not shift quickly enough to those operating models were, unless they were in kind of captive markets, they were disrupted. So I think we're just going to see a much faster rate of disruption of companies that are not in these captive markets, with the companies who do figure this out and have AI native operating models being able to capture more and more of their markets. And the book, by the way, the whole goal of the book is to say, well, we actually don't want an economy where 10 companies that are worth 10 trillion each and have the entire thing. We're better off having a more diverse economy where a lot of businesses, whether they're startups or incumbents, do transform, leverage these new ways of working, and get these productivity benefits of AI.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting too, because you see these AI native companies who don't have that scale and that complexity, and they're just doing it, and they're doing it with like 10 people. Just like, okay. But if I'm, the CEO or the CHRO, COO of this bigger company, what should I do? Because it's really hard to undo all of that. Like, it's a big system, and you can't just like scrap it and say we're starting over. Or can you? I don't know.
Yeah. Or can you?
Yeah, I think that's the key question. So the guidance and the Output Tech book has these mechanisms, which are just these different models, mental models that can be whiteboarded. And the idea is, and it comes with these, actually, they call them the 7 shifts, where you can kind of pick and choose each one to get started on this. Because I think the challenge is it's a really fundamental and issue because it has to do with the actual operating model of the organization. So changing that overnight is not usually realistic. I think, Jessica, to get back to your point, that the fully AI native companies, like one of the case, I've got case studies there of these big enterprises in the book, like Vanguard or Commonwealth Bank of Australia, but also like Cognition AI, right, who grew extremely quickly with an entirely AI native operating model and a cadence, basically planning cadence that's a week, not a year, and a kind of unconstrained output environment where they're able to throw away more of what they build that week than they keep and pass on to their customers. So they're able to hypothesis test in parallel and do all these sorts of things. So I think the good thing is we now have or are starting to see enough examples of these fully AI native ways of working. We're starting to see larger companies who did structure themselves well through the age of software and digital, like the Netflix and AWS and parts of Microsoft and all these, like a whole lot of the startups who thrived, who are leveraging AI effectively. And then, so I think it really is a question of how quickly you can move a larger enterprise to those models. And I think at the core of that is this harder problem, which is these organizations they have these separate structures. It's really how quickly you can deploy what I think has to be a kind of a single unifying structure, where basically the org chart, the ownership structure, the sort of the value stream structure, what you're delivering to customers in terms of products and platforms. There's just one. It's just one tree structure that I call the outcome tree in the book, where you've got this cascade of basically inputs like strategy and budget going down all the way to teams. Now, of course, some of those teams are fully autonomous. They're just agents, but it's a human leadership structure, because in the end, the book actually proposes humans should continue reporting to humans, which I don't know if that's controversial or not, but
I think generally it's a good idea. Yeah.
yeah, I outlined like quite clearly why this is actually a control structure for leveraging agents to do what we want them to do, rather than us thinking agents will make better decisions than we do. There's actually a whole theory behind it that I think is really important, which is that there's some things that are, that AI is just not going to get that much better at than humans. And those are highly complex systems with emergent behaviors, whether that's kind of stock markets or weather or decision making in large enterprises or any
Yeah.
size of company,
Yeah.
really. But where you basically have this unified structure. So to me, it's a question of how quickly can you move this organization away from the crazy matrix stuff you put in place and all those processes to this single structure where all of these things are aligned around this cascade of, and hierarchical cascade, interestingly, because that's
Yeah.
the only thing, as Adrian Cockcroft pointed out to me, that really scales in nature and organizations, is these self-similar hierarchies where you've got kind of encapsulation and ownership at each level, right? The CEO, should not be telling teams exactly what to do. Now, how many branches you have at each level of the outcome tree? Obviously, you've got examples like NVIDIA, where you might have 60 directs from the top to the next level, but you still have ownership as you go down, right? You still have encapsulation. You have direct connectivity to customer outcomes as you go down this tree. So it can be a very flat organization with very broad branches. I think Netflix is another example of that, as you mentioned, Jessica. But I think organizations need to move that structure and away from these again parallel structures where, let's say, again, the product value streams and platform value streams are completely misaligned with the incentives of the leaders behind them. And that, by the way, is back to that issue with the 8%. A lot of these transformations failed because organizations had the technology teams put in place the right structures. Nothing really changed that significantly on the business side. The compensation structure of leaders did not change significantly, so no one was investing properly in platforms, right? What good looked like in terms of technology organizations in the last 10 years or so, 15, is around half your investments, broadly speaking, went into platforms. What it looked like in enterprises, it was like 15, 20%. And that's because, of course, you didn't change the incentive structure of the business leaders who were never properly incentivized to invest in platforms, because there wasn't a direct customer outcome that next month from investing in a platform. So interestingly and bizarrely, I actually did spend like half a chapter just on incentive structure in this book.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah,
Well,
which
tell
I
us
didn't think
the-
I'd be writing about, but I thought, okay, someone's got to write about this.
Say more. Say more.
Well, it's making sure that with this outcome tree, where this is really the structure, let's say use OKRs, use some kind of objective tracking system. There's this cascade of ownership at each level of the tree. You've got a leader, you've got a team of humans and agents, and their objectives and their incentives have to be the same thing. And their objectives have to be 100% on outcomes, 0% on outputs, and the team has to have full autonomy on what outputs they build to deliver those outcomes. They have to have a budget, like they can't blow through the whole company's token budget in the next month. So they have an input of a budget, and that's be aligned to the strategy, but they have full ownership of outcomes, and the leaders incentivize purely on those outcomes, and it cascades down. Which, by the way, that's exactly how I had set up my organizational structure, and of course evolved it many times as Tasktop scaled. And I think a lot of others, these structures have been proven out. But again, if you look across organizations, especially enterprises, it's the exception, not the norm.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say one topic that comes up all the time for us is performance management. I think we were just talking about it in the last one. But yeah, I mean, you get the behavior you incentivize, and yet we seem to be surprised by that so often, right? Like, why are they doing that? It's like, well, it's because of how you created your incentive structure, right? And honestly, it seems like we reward outputs over outcomes most of the time, right? It's just like activity over results is what gets you your bonus, or how you're incentivized. I think just because that part feels, and maybe I don't know if that's the case, feels easier to measure, or outputs, activity, we can say, look, I did all this stuff, whereas outcomes in terms of business impact seems to be harder to translate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of the crux of it, right? Is that outputs are easier to measure. I think we've got management systems that are very good at measuring outputs, right? And a lot of those systems come back from just really management systems that came from, let's say, manufacturing, right? Like
Yeah.
if
Widgets.
you're, yeah, widgets,
Yeah.
exactly. It's about widgets. So if you're manufacturing cars, you've got like the number of cars your factory produces and the quality of those cars is going to be a measure of your success because you're output constrained, right? But now all of a sudden, if you could, and this is kind of around the corner, I don't know if it's 10 or 30 years or 3 years, but if you have a dark factory producing unlimited cars and the cost of the cars is really just the cost of electricity, then you're no longer output constrained. And measuring how many cars you're delivering becomes meaningless because really all that matters is how quickly you're able to deliver cars that delight customers and that grow your market share and then increase your profit margins and all those business metrics. So I think it made more sense. And also we were fundamentally output constrained, right? The reason so many of the management systems around agile and everything else, there's so much of it was around prioritization of the scarcest resource, which was your developers and,
Hmm.
and that productivity and all your other knowledge workers. And again, that's changing right now too.
Right.
So that constraint gets removed in the age of AI. And so, yeah, the management system has to shift from managing outputs to outcomes. But the challenge is it's been easier and I think I just want to unpack this a bit more because I think it's such a fundamental issue. It's been easier to measure outputs, right? We're very good at measuring pull requests and features and vulnerabilities fixed and tokens consumed, tokens consumed are actually just a cost, but a cost because it's easiest to measure cost metrics. Then the next easiest thing is output metrics. And then the slightly harder thing is outcome metrics.
Mm.
But I think that's where, that's given how much more quickly right now you're able to iterate. One of the reasons outcome metrics were harder to measure is the lag. They were lagging indicators, right? So you
Yeah.
would build some cool mobile experience, you'd add chat to it, AI chat and so on. And previously it would take time before that translated into better net promoter scores from customers or better or just market share or ARR growth or those sorts of things. But we're now, because of kind of removing the constraint on outputs, that's able to happen so much more quickly that I think outcomes are actually becoming easier to measure because the loop moves faster. You're going
Mm.
faster through customer iterations. You can do parallel iterations if you kind of farm out agents to do these sorts of things. And again, they become the only thing that's really meaningful in the age where outputs just trend towards the cost of electricity.
Yeah. And so if we're talking about, sort of alignment and outcomes and empowerment, kind of in the system, how important do you think things like OKRs are anymore? And I've never been a fan of bonuses to begin with. I think they're silly because, again, and I would say in the world of AI, things are changing even faster to what the goal is, right? Because especially if you're in a startup, you don't know what the next 6 months is going to be. You're making it up as you go along. So why are we going to bonus people on X when actually we want them doing Y? Because we figure that out in the first 3 weeks of setting the bonus, right? So I mean, how important do you think those types of goal setting and like just even having a bonus is anymore? Do you think that those are relevant?
Yeah, I think those are really interesting. And I know I certainly experimented with zero bonuses. The zero bonuses for salespeople is fascinating. That was a very short-lived experiment.
Yeah, I think
Like,
for
like we,
sales, it still works, but for engineers,
yeah,
I don't
I
know.
actually, where I left, right before we sold Tasktop, we were still zero bonuses for engineers or engineering leaders.
Yeah.
And of course, commissions for sales. And then other bonuses, the rest of the bonus is purely like 100% based on OKR attainment. So I think there are kind of two things here, or maybe there are probably more than two things. But one is kind of the with AI changing the pace of things, and both for established companies who may need to evolve their business model or where their business model is impacted, as well, or for new companies who are just going to pivot their way through finding just product market fit while frontier models change all the time and their harness becomes obsolete the next time Anthropic releases something and then those sorts of things. So I think the key thing is we're in a world where the pace of change is obviously insanely fast right now. And so these long horizon things are problematic, right? At the same rate, if you're, whether you're deploy, there needs to be some kind of longer term planning. So I think it just becomes a question of what's your pace of planning,
Yeah.
because you still see the AI native companies who need to plan on a quarterly basis. Like quarters are not going away, right? I
Yeah.
just don't. And so, and actually, rather than saying everything's going to turn into completely dynamic planning and so on, the approach I took with output to outcome is to actually say, well, just have your core mechanisms, again, at that team level, just be much faster, where their outcome loop is a very fast loop, but it does cascade up into a weekly, monthly, and quarterly structure. Like and maybe you can do your budgeting, like, if you're moving fast enough, you can do like replan on including budgets at a monthly and quarterly basis rather than annual. But there still has to be this cadence where you're bringing in, sort of the various stakeholders, sometimes board members and others, if you're making fundamental shifts in what you're doing. So I actually think that, but this is, I think it'd be interesting to debate this, that OKRs or a structure that's similar to that are still very important, because they have to. The other tricky thing with outcomes is that it's very easy to define activities. Like, we launched X, we hit our 1.0 goals, and so on. We built the next model. Whereas I think the best practices around OKRs, and certainly what I put in output to outcome, is they actually have to be quantifiable. They have to be numbers. And those numbers have to be based on outcomes, not activities. So all of a sudden, if you're able to plan those on shorter timeframes, it's more work to determine those outcomes, but then you can actually, put agents on, a team of people and agents, or in some cases, it's an autonomous value stream with agents fully running the loops. They're the ones delivering on outcomes and reporting that to some kind of human. They'll be the first line leader in the organization at that point. But I think, in the end, there has to be a planning mechanism that's based on quantifiable outcomes, because at this pace, and especially with significant amounts of agents in the loop, it's the only way you can iterate quickly enough. And that I think that pace of iteration shortens, obviously, the ability for you to plan out a year in terms of people's bonuses and so on, I think is very tricky. But I do think having that at least weekly, monthly, quarterly cadence of planning through OKRs or something similar is key.
Yeah, I think planning is very important. And that's where you get alignment. You figure out what worked and what didn't, and what you're going to do next and why. And you're thinking deeply about the bets that you're going to take and the hypotheses that you have, and the trade-offs that you're going to make, and what you're going to do versus what you're not going to do. Like, those things, I think, are increasingly more important. But, like, do we know what's going to happen at the end of the year? And I don't know. That's what I don't. I think incentives really need to be looked at for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think the interesting thing with planning is I think a lot of organizations are seeing it's becoming the constraint.
Yeah.
Right? As teams can deliver more, you actually ability to consume that feedback, make sure you have telemetry on that to see, did these things deliver the value that we wanted? Do we have the right level of telemetry in our products and services? Which, again, obviously a lot of sort of cloud AI native organizations grew up with that. A lot of organizations don't have sufficient telemetry. So I think that, and that's really, again, kind of around like what they call it, applying the theory of constraints to your outcome loop. So looking at like, do we have full visibility, and are we able to plan quickly? And then what's the constraint? Is the constraint actually making sure that what we've built, because of course there's still a maturity curve organizations are going through in terms of being able to deploy solutions built by agents and ensuring that they're architected and performing in the right ways. So there's still a whole bunch of sort of software development, AI development, lifecycle work that has to happen there. So is that the constraint, or have we actually figured that part out now? And the constraint is actually our ability to plan and pivot and deploy additional resources. And when companies get this right, you'll actually see that they're hiring more people than they were before. So
I know this whole we're laying off all these people for AI is not true, in my opinion. I think these companies are still hiring. Like Microsoft, they just did a big layoff. They're still hiring, but they're probably laying off the people that aren't going to be able to make that transition. Would you agree or not?
I would agree, but I think there's also this other effect, which is the companies that, again, are not structured to get the benefits of AI are going to fall into this bad trap of laying people off, while automating things with AI, but not getting much more business outcomes. The ones who have established that loop, so that they're getting more outcomes, more market share, more revenue, more profit, whatever their goals are. And then that actually takes more humans to amplify. And that's exactly what's playing out, whether it's the frontier labs or AI native startups or these sorts of things. They figure that out. And so they're in a growth mode, both in terms of their tokens and their people.
So I don't. As you were talking, I was just thinking. I think like the way we think about leadership and the role of a leader is really going to change in this new construct. Like, what do you think leaders need to be thinking about and changing, and how they're leading their teams and managing their people?
Yeah, that's the hard question. That was so. I left this chapter. I knew I had to write to research this and think through it and talk to a lot of people about it. This is the last chapter in the book. It's actually called Managers to Makers, and it took longer by like 2x to write than any of the other chapters because it's such an interesting problem. We're still learning so much about it. So I think, and this is similar to how I think have to address long-term planning, right? Which is some things we can sort of figure out through first principles. I started writing this book a year and a half ago, and I was assuming back then that organizations could go from like 2x to 10x productivity gains with AI native development because agents were going to work at some point. They definitely weren't working very well back then, but we can extrapolate some of these things, right? We can extrapolate that we've got Mythos and Fable today, and we may get, the next 1 or 2 generations of supermodels that don't get shut down because of national security concerns. Like, we don't exactly know, but we can extrapolate that either things move faster on the model progression, in which case, some of the technical aspects of software architecture and software development matter less, or they go slower and they matter a bit more in terms of clean architectures and such. So I think we're right now, a lot is changing, but I think we can extrapolate quite a bit in terms of whether it'll go faster or slower, and then figure out where, in the end, what leadership roles the organization needs to support that. And so I think one thing that's like, the way I look at it is what will some of those invariants be, right? I think we now know that in terms of sort of first line leadership roles, that those are going to be different, right? Or individual let's just start with individual contributors, right? An individual contributor, and I loved being a developer, individual contributor. It was 2 decades ago now, I guess. But sadly, that role is gone, right? Those people are now actually someone who was building software on their own in a dark corner somewhere is now supporting many agents, and now has to actually talk to a lot of other people because their roles become a bit more like a product manager, right? Because they now should be reporting on what outcomes they're delivering, not just cranking out lines of code. So I think, by the way, that chapter I went back and forth, it should be called Makers to Managers or Managers to Makers, because in the end, it's both, right? There's no more role that's completely a maker because now everything becomes collaborative, because kind of building the knowledge output is the parts that's been automated. So I think first line manager roles change completely. And I also think makers whose job was just really doing reporting and planning and kind of all that manual coordination, that's completely gone because AI makes all of that easy and free. Is all of that sort of tedious coordination and reporting. And so, and not to mention that every manager can actually now build really interesting things to support their teams, to support their roadmaps, and so on. So I think that these roles of managers and makers just become blended, where all leaders need to be hands-on with AI to help support their teams and kind of the mission of their value streams and their outcomes. And again, the other really big shift is that leaders need to shift from managing outputs to managing outcomes, which is, per your point, Pete, that's a really big shift in terms of what you're measuring, because that role of you just don't need it anymore, right? You don't need someone who's asking, where are we at with this? Did we deliver X? And so on. That's all gone. That kind of task, thankfully, I think that kind of taskmaster role. And then I think it really is around creating this kind of cascade of ownership and empowerment and the organizational structure that results, and architecting and re-architecting the organization for outcomes so that you have the right kind of partitioning and ownership of teams, kind of these hybrid human and agent teams, in some cases fully autonomous agentic teams. That outcome architecture just becomes a key part of leadership. So
Yeah. I mean, I think you said some important things there. And one thing I hope that the listeners that are leaders here, if you're not hands-on with AI, that's a big problem. And, I also think that your ability to be really clear and get the alignment within the team, like you're not, as you said, Mick, you're not like the task manager anymore. You're setting the context for everyone to be successful, right?
yeah,
And the clarity for everyone to be able to be empowered and go manage these agents or create these things, whatever you're wanting them to do. But most managers are very good at that, like execution, maybe more functional leadership level, but they're not as good at like setting the clarity and the alignment and really setting the vision of what we're not going to do and why, and what we are going to do and why.
yeah,
So
that's right. I think it becomes that. So it becomes, like there's different ways of looking at it, but it's like every one of those managers needs to be the kind of CEO of their team in the value stream to have end-to-end ownership, and in the end to support their team to remove impediments because of course the team given to the right strategy and structure is going to be able to deliver on that. Now, if of course, and that I still think there's a lot of work there, because the starting point for many organizations is this one team who should be responsible for end-to-end outcomes has these 10 dependencies on 10 other teams. So one of the first things you need to do is give them that autonomy and that independence of action, so they don't have to ask permission. They can just run at the speed they would be running in an AI native startup, and that's a lot of work. So I think there's a lot of work for leadership to provide that, the structure where these AI amplified teams can thrive.
I think
Pete, last
definitively a shift
question.
in. Oh, well, I
You
was
get
just
the
saying.
last question.
Oh boy, I didn't have a great question.
Question.
I was just going to comment more on what we were just talking about, but
Go ahead and
well, just
comment and then question.
when you think about what the skill set is for managers, it's also having to look at what a manager actually is. I mean, you mentioned that makers to managers, managers to makers. You're managing. I mean, it seems to me like there's a perception that you know managers who are more experienced or seasoned are thinking, well, I will still manage teams of people that do the AI stuff, right? Versus I need to actually own that, right? But I think to your point, it's a pretty big shift in thinking for people into like, well, now I need to become far more of a visionary, right? A mid-level manager might have been very good at executing on instructions given, but now they're having to come up with that, right? Which I think changes things for people quite a lot. It's going to be very hard. So how do you, I mean, is that a learnable skill? Like, what do you think that does to, those folks out there from a leadership perspective who are in management roles, and, how do you get ahead of that?
Yeah, and I think I think there's, we're seeing a lot of concern from middle managers as their role changes almost. I think the role of obviously teams and developers and individual contributors changes dramatically. And we see some of them leaning into it, some of them not. And I think for the organizations where the middle managers were set up as these kind of instruction passers and reporters and kind of building empires based on how much headcount they have, that role's gone.
Yeah.
Thankfully. Yeah.
And thankfully, but of course, my hope is that we encourage as many of them as possible to lean into this new role where they're responsible for the vision, the outcomes, the delivery, the interactions with customers, and supporting their teams to deliver those outcomes. So I think, yeah, back to your question, Jessica, I think there's just the fact that some people might not make that transition as quickly is going to result in kind of some middle management job cuts, right? And these organizations, to your previous point, have gotten very hierarchical for some of the wrong reasons as well. So they no longer need that many levels of reporting. But I don't think that's the same thing as, that whole Jack Dorsey thing is that you don't need hierarchy, right? If you don't have hierarchy, you're going to make holacracy and it's going to be all going to the CEO and everyone has to ask the CEO for permission. And that's not empowerment, right? That's a very different structure. So I think it's going to be a mix of both. I think there's a really important role for middle management in these organizations. It's just really different than the legacy role you described, Pete.
Yeah, and I think that maybe something for founders, the executive team to think about is like, how do they help coach and train their people to get there? And not everybody will, but like I don't think organizations are really thinking about that either. Like, what are the skills that we're going to need, 5 years from now from, a leadership perspective? How's it going to look in the organization? And then how do we get our people to stop doing what they're doing now and start doing those things, right?
Yeah.
So it'll be very interesting. We'll have you back on the show. How about not 5 years, but let's have you back on the show in like a year, and we can see
where it
what
went.
our predictions, are coming true or not. Mik, we always put a little pressure on our guest at the end, and we ask you to leave us with something inspiring. I actually think a lot of what you're talking about is inspiring, but people could be bummed out by it because we've been talking about, how, what's not going to work. But leave us something inspiring today. What would you like to say?
I think for all those leaders and managers out there, just if you get your hands on the latest models, the most advanced ones, and just experiment and play. I think there's a lot of backlash and all of those sorts of things, but I think the only way that we make AI work for us and for our teams, rather than vice versa, which is I think the key thing we identified, is to leverage it, right? It's not going to go away, and I think the more quickly you can bring your teams and your organization along, the faster. And I think we're seeing just the power these change agents have, who demonstrate how much easier, more joyful, more fun work can be when you actually apply these things in the right ways. So I think that's the main thing, is just get your hands on. It's on the latest models, and I think everything's out there, and start using them for your core parts, the most meaningful parts of your day-to-day job of supporting your teams and supporting others in your organization. Because I think in the end, we talked about some of these big transitions, they can be facilitated with AI. It can help you make those. I actually when realizing this, kind of late in the game, I put in every chapter, I put prompts for AI agents in the book for how to help you make some of these organizational structure transitions. Because of course, those can be facilitated. Those bottlenecks identified and so on. So yeah, just don't wait, lean in now,
and
get the latest models.
Yeah, and get Mik's book because it has all the
That's
prompts.
Right. It's got the prompts.
The book is out next week?
Yeah, July 14th. Yeah.
July 14th. And so everybody can get it on Amazon, wherever you get your books. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, we hope it is super successful, and we are going to buy it. And Pre-order. Is there a pre-order right now?
There's a pre-order. Yeah.
Okay.
Pete's pre-ordered clearly. So yeah.
Yes. And so, again, people get the book and listen to what Mik says, because he's been studying this and he's right. It's coming. Don't resist it. Embrace it. And it's gonna make, I think it's gonna make work more enjoyable for sure.
Exactly. Yeah. I'll take the burden out. That's the hope. So.
That's right. Well, thank you, Mik, for coming on the show. We loved having you.
Well, thank you so much,
Thanks,
Jessica.
Mik.
Thanks, Pete. That was really fun.
Okay. Don't hang up, Mik.